Hello and welcome back, adventurers. This is Captain TTRPG, and today we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition.
Hello, adventurers. Welcome back. Today we are talking about the fighter class. But we're not going to talk about a class guide for the fighter or ranking the fighter subclasses, not that it actually has them. No, today we're going to talk about the problems that the class has, and more importantly, the problems that it causes for the system. For those of you who aren't aware, the fighter class doesn't have a mechanic that's special to themselves. Something like, Barbarian's Rage or Ranger's ability to hunt prey. It doesn't have anything like that. It does have stances, somewhat like the monk does, but it doesn't have the variety of stances or a reliance on stances like the monk does, but that's its closest comparison. Instead, what it has as a class feature is an increased proficiency level with weapons, which is to say, all other martial classes, except for one, and we'll get to that, start with trained proficiency in martial weapons, where the fighter gets to start with expert proficiency, and by the time others are getting to expert proficiency, they get master with one type, but again, we'll talk about why that's a problem. And then as others get to master, they hit legendary with that one, and then finally they get legendary with all weapons, something that others don't get. Again, -1, and we'll talk about that. So why is that a problem? And what could we do to change the fighter so that this problem doesn't exist? Well, first, let's talk about why that is a problem. There's two reasons that's a problem. The first is that it feels stronger, significantly stronger than other characters early on in the game. Now, other classes can do a variety of things, not necessarily just focus on damage like the fighter does. But when you've got new players coming into the system, and one of them is playing a fighter, especially if they focus on melee weapons, like two-handed big melee weapons, or even strong, high damage dice one-handed melee weapons, early on, when you've got these characters playing together, you're going to have the fighter who's going to crit more often than everybody else, and when they crit, are going to hit extremely hard. Let me just give an example. I have a fighter in one of my games, and even at level 1, he was using a two-handed weapon, so the most extreme example, a two-handed melee weapon. When he would crit using one of the feats they get at level 1, where you, for 2 actions, if you strike, you deal an extra damage dice. So a selection that I think a lot of fighters will do if they're going to go with a big, heavy two-handed build, was hitting for 40 plus damage on a crit. While I've got other characters playing very interesting classes, let's take the kineticist, for example. At early levels, was playing it very much in a melee way, which is a good way to play because you get to use your strength and con modifiers with a 2-action attack. So we've got 2 actions from the fighter, dealing 40 plus damage, 43, 44, on a crit. And then you have the kineticist using a 2-action attack in melee, so very similar design, and when they're hitting and critting, they're doing maybe low 20s if they're doing well. That is a vast difference when you're looking at the same resources used, the same actions used, and even that 20-something should feel pretty good. That should feel like a strong hit. But not only can they not hit quite as hard, they're not critting nearly as often, right? They have a 10% lower crit chance against your average enemies than the fighter does. So the fighter's critting all the time and hitting for a ton of damage, and that makes it feel unbalanced. Especially when you throw other classes in, I would say that the kineticist actually can hold up pretty well early levels, but then we look at something like an investigator, also in that same group, can't hit nearly as hard. Even now at a much higher level when they've got extra dice on their weapons, doesn't crit like the fighter does and can't do anywhere near the damage even when in melee. So we end up with this imbalance early on, which it's fine for some characters to do more damage than others. However, when you've got new players, it doesn't feel great, especially if they're all early level trying to do some level of damage. When you've got a different class, let's say a cleric, again, in that team, they have a cleric. That cleric isn't focused on damage. They're focused on healing, they're focused on what they can do with their spells, and it's more control and support. So they don't feel that same pull of the negative effect of the fighter, but they still see it on the team. It makes it feel as if the only one who matters on the battlefield when they get going is the fighter, because everybody else is doing little bits of damage here and there, and the fighter's taking out an enemy every single round, at least one. That's a serious problem for the system. And again, it's that high rate of crits that's really making the difference here. Now, I did mention that there's another class that has the same starting at expert and moving up quickly, and that is the gunslinger. Interestingly, yes, there's a gunslinger on this team too. So I'm getting to see all this play out together. Now, the gunslinger has the extra chance to crit. And when the gunslinger crits, they hit very, very hard. Do they hit quite as hard as the fighter? Not necessarily, but it only takes one action for them to crit. Granted, they have to reload, so it's give and take here or there. Their crits hit really hard, and they do crit more often than other martial characters. But the reason theirs doesn't feel as bad is when they're not getting a crit with their ranged weapons, with their firearms, the damage that they're doing on a regular hit is very basic, very almost subpar, as ranged weapons are supposed to feel in the system, right? You should have to put yourself up on melee to do extra damage. That's the philosophy, and that holds true. So because they're focused on firearms as their only option to get that extra crit chance to do this extra damage, they don't see the same overall negative position to put the other team members in as the fighter does. So that fighter still feels stronger than everybody else, even when you've got this gunslinger who's got this extra proficiency. So why do I think it's a fighter problem, and yet I don't call it a gunslinger problem? It's that focus in a specific way on a weapon type that, one, is very narrow. Firearms are a very narrow type of weapon, and also it's ranged only. It's in one specific area that they get this boost. And so that doesn't cause the same problem that I think the fighter does. Now, if you've got a fighter who took, bows at bow, they're doing long bows or even compound bows, they're not going to feel the same as somebody walking up with a big 1d12 two-hander or something 1d10 melee weapon or even a 1d8 melee weapon where they're going to cause these huge damage numbers. That's all going to feel different. Having said that, we then get into what I think is the next problem with the fighter's design is it narrows the design of other classes. So you've got this fighter that their whole thing at level 1, yes, they get reactive strike. I'm not going to count that as their whole thing. Others get reactive strike pretty easily by level 6, a lot of martial classes. So their whole thing at level 1, realistically, is their higher proficiency with martial weapons. And simple weapons, and they're slightly higher with advanced. Yes, I know, it all rolls together. This higher crit chance, really, is what we're talking about, is their whole personality. It's everything for them. Because that's everything, it means that other martials don't get to play in that sandbox. Again, let's look at the one other that does get it, which is our gunslinger. They still get other things. They have a subclass, they get special ways to reload, cool things at the start, and yet they still don't feel overpowered because the only thing they get a boosted crit chance in is firearms, which has downsides to it. You've got reloading you have to do. On a hit without that's not a crit, it doesn't hit that hard. They don't feel the same as a fighter does. But let's look at other characters like the monk. In my opinion, and everybody should feel free to disagree with me here. In my opinion, monks should have a higher crit chance, meaning a higher proficiency level with unarmed strikes than anybody else should have. I'm just putting it out there. They are and should be the masters of unarmed strikes. And yet, at level 1, a fighter can be stronger with unarmed strikes than a monk. And that feels inherently wrong to me. There's other problems with the monk class, I think, here or there. I do like it as a class, actually, it's one of my favorites. They have some other issues, but this just stands out as something that feels obvious to me. And it's not the only class that's being hurt by fighter in this way. Monks will never get to legendary with their unarmed strikes or with any weapon. Neither will any other martial, with the exception of the gunslinger. So you've got this whole tier of proficiency that nobody's allowed to reach because the fighter got it, and it's their entire identity. Where other classes should be getting there, but in a narrow focus, right? Barbarians. Okay, if we gave barbarians expertise in two-handed weapons, yes, that would be kind of crazy and maybe hit too hard. We'd have to scale back rage to pull that off. So there'd have to be some more tweaking there if we wanted to do that and make that feel okay. And we've got other classes, though. We've got the ranger. Maybe they should get expertise in bows. Maybe when we look at other classes like the rogue, maybe they should get expertise in knives. There are these things that should happen, allowing these characters to start at higher proficiency and getting up to legendary that don't get to because of the fighter hogging that entire territory. Now, we look at other proficiencies, right? We look at armor training. There's not a whole lot of characters that get up to legendary with armor training. We have the champion, which gets there with all. We have monks that get there with unarmored, kind of doing what I'm talking about for weapons, but with armor. We have a playtest class that's also getting it as well. So we're going to have a few that'll have legendary in armor training, but it's different because that extra in armor training, yes, they're more defensive. They will be more survivable than others. And when you're looking at a team makeup, that doesn't feel the same way to the other characters that having that extra crit chance and being the overall damage dealer on the field does. If you've got a teammate who, they can really survive things, they almost never get crit, that's not going to have the same feel bad for you who gets crit slightly more that the, hey, you're the one who always taking out the enemies does in fact have. And notice that it's not restricting others getting that legendary proficiency in armor. We have others getting that. When we look at all the other proficiencies, perception, the different saving throws, class DC, spell DC, we have a lot of characters who get to legendary with all of these different things. One getting there doesn't restrict the others because it's not their class identity. Even when we talk about the champion, their class identity isn't the fact that they get legendary with armor proficiency. Their class identity is more around their subclass that gives them this reaction that does very interesting things depending on which subclass they go. They have a class identity outside of their armor. That's what fighter needs. They need a class identity that isn't I crit more than everybody else. That is a weak class identity. And I talked about this a little bit in a different video, the fact that they have a problem with this class, that it doesn't have some sort of mechanic. And I'm not going to pretend to be able to design a great mechanic for the fighter. Not even going to go there. But Paizo can. They are amazing designers. I love what they've put out. They've done so unique things with all of their classes that I know that they have the capability of making an interesting mechanic for the fighter. It doesn't need to be complex. I don't think it should be. Fighter's meant to be an easy class to play. Whatever mechanic they get should be easy to understand, easy to apply, something you don't forget, right? We look at other classes that have very easy mechanics. Barbarian's Rage, very easy. Ranger, I would say, is pretty easy. Not as easy as Barbarian, but it's still easy. There are classes that have easy mechanics. Monk, going into stances, is pretty easy. Yes, I still think they should be able to go into one as a free action on start of initiative, but still, it's an easy mechanic. You're in this stance, you do these strikes. Cool. We can understand that. That is not hard for a new player to pick up and play. So you can keep it simple, but give them a class identity. If they had a class identity, if they had a mechanic, you could suddenly have subclasses for it. Again, they don't have to be crazy. They don't have to be hard to understand, but you can have them adding more diversity to fighters, which otherwise the only way you have diversity is if you really build it in yourself. So when we really sit down and look at it, this is what the fighter problem is to me. It's lack of class identity. It's making other martials feel ineffective on the battlefield. And it is taking away opportunities for other martials to hit that legendary proficiency with weapons that more really should have the possibility of getting to. I think the fighter needs a serious rework. We're not going to get it, I know that, but I think it would be great for the game if we did. Anyway, thank you for listening to me once again. I am always surprised that anybody watches these videos, but I am thankful for it. I love your comments. I'm getting more comments all the time, and I appreciate everybody's views. You have some great thoughts out there. Please give me some more of those. And while you're doing that, I'm going to think about what I would like a mechanic for the fighter to be, and who knows, maybe I'll put it into a video one day. In any case, as always, adventure on.